Good evening or good afternoon. My name is Rosa Wevers and I'm the moderator of the Face Value panel that we're organizing today with the Netherlands Film Festival and IMPAKT Center for Media Culture. And this panel is about technology, but it is also, as you can see, a lot with technology because we have an audience in the studio. Welcome to you all. We also have an audience joining us online, so welcome if you're looking from your laptop. And this hybrid approach is also visible in the setup of the panel of today. I'm very happy to have with me in the studio Ella Jakubowska and Dr. Christine Quinnen. And then joining us online are Dr. Heather Dewey-Hagborg, welcome, and Dr. Nakeema Stefflbauer. In the previous panel, we talked about face filters and how that can be creates a lot of possibilities for expressing your identity. And now we're gonna stay with the face, but we're gonna talk about facial recognition technologies. And these technologies are literally everywhere around us. So perhaps before entering this panel, you unlocked your phone with your face, and that's already a form of facial recognition. But we also see that these types of technologies are used at border control, at public protests, and for example, at job interviews. Facial recognition technologies scan our faces and save that data in a database. And this is a process that often stays unnoticed. Often when this happens to us, we are not very much aware of it because it's very much black box. It's not so visible. Increasingly, we are learning about the risks and issues that come with these type of technologies. And only 2 weeks ago, Maxime Februari, who is a journalist, warned us in the NRC about these type of technologies. And he said, biometric identification threatens our fundamental rights and freedoms. We pay a large price for using facial recognition because it's the end of our anonymity and the end of our naivety. Our bodies become sources of evidence in someone else's war. And a recent film, Coded Bias, that came out also warned us for other types of issues that come with facial recognition, such as discrimination, because these technologies tend to be not so objective as we might think that they are. In fact, they're very much biased. As Maxime Februari, but also the Coded Bias movie point out, is that facial recognition and the risks of that not only have to do with privacy, but very much with issues of power and identity. And that is what we will discuss in the panel. So we're going to talk about the politics of technology and how facial recognition systems are connected to power structures and implicated in processes of in- and exclusion. We will do that through 3 guiding questions. Firstly, we will look at the ways in which facial recognition systems are implicated in structures of exclusion and discrimination. And we'll ask, what are the social and political consequences of the growing presence of facial recognition systems in public spaces? Secondly, on a perhaps a bit more philosophical level, we'll look at what does the digital transformation of our faces to code mean for how we experience as well as express our identities and for how we look at faces. And thirdly, towards the end of the panel, we'll also talk about possible solutions and ask how can we reclaim our face in the digital space and are there any possibilities for resistance? We have 4 wonderful speakers here today. I'm really happy that you all said yes to my invitation. And each of the 4 speakers will really bring a new perspective to the table. So we have somebody looking at this from an artistic perspective. We have advocacy, law, and gender studies research. And I think together we'll really learn a lot about the issues that have to do with facial recognition. Good to know if you're watching this via the live stream, but also if you're watching this in the studio, it is very much possible to ask questions and they will be addressed during the end of the panel, but you can ask them throughout because I can imagine maybe you hear one of the speakers speaking and you think, I want to know this or I don't understand this. So please make sure to ask them. And you can do that via the website sli.do, so it's sli.do. This is a web browser, so you don't need to download anything. And here you can ask questions in the chat, and for that you need to fill in the password, and that is, in capitals, NFF 2021. So again, NFF 2021 via sli.do. All right, I'm curious to hear what your questions are, but of course, let's first start with the panel. Without further ado, I would very much like to introduce our first speaker of today, and that is Dr. Nakeema Stefflbauer. Dr. Nakeema Stefflbauer is a senior digitalization executive and the founder and CEO of Vrouwenloop, which is a non-profit organization in Berlin that trains residents, immigrant and refugee women in computer programming. Nakeema is an advocate for digital inclusion, tech equity and transparency, and is a graduate of Harvard University and Brown University, and she also holds a Master's of Business Administration. She writes and speaks about the impact of digital technologies on marginalized groups and has given keynotes at, amongst others, the EU Parliament in Brussels. And today she's here, online in Utrecht, to tell us more about the politics of facial recognition. Nakeema, please go ahead.
Great. So first, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to just giving a few thoughts to begin with about where we are today. And I'll start off by saying that where we are today is in a data-filled world in which we have so many multitudes of data that is being collected that it's often very difficult to think about this from a holistic perspective. We are facing a world in which today our health data, travel data, purchase data, the data from our browsers and the websites we visit, as well as the data from our chat messages and messaging services, is at risk. In addition to that, which has already been quite a complex message to communicate to all the different ages and groups and geographies of users who are active on the web, we have biometric data, which means what? It means our faces and how we look, our voices and how we sound, our gait or the way that we walk, which apparently is equally unique as our faces or our fingerprints, how we behave in terms of video capture, which you may be familiar with in terms of the rise of deepfakes, modifying the behavior of existing video capture for the purpose of entertainment. Think of Anthony Bourdain's posthumous video. We also are looking at a world in which our biometric identities in terms of our ethnicity and our racial background can be interpreted, can be classified, and can be utilized as fair game for identifying us, for tracking us, and for categorizing us. This is blurring the line between, as I show in my slide, surveillance and human classification. Both of these things are obviously equally bad, but what's increasingly important to recognize, I think, is that this tracking and tracing in what has been called the perpetual lineup is being tested first and foremost on vulnerable populations. It's being tested on asylum seekers, imprisoned people, formerly incarcerated people, and it's receiving a level of acceptance based on targeting people who have the least likelihood of standing up and effectively blocking these technologies from being used on them. And most important, people, governments, and businesses are opting in to more and more biometric data collection and classification all over the world. What this involves is the scraping, the recording, the storing, and the sharing of data that none of us are able to change. This is not a hard drive that is suddenly compromised. These are our faces. These are the ways that we walk. These are our ethnic and racial backgrounds. What I'd like to explore on this panel is where it leaves us when we have a 24/7 digital culture that lulls the average person into thinking that we aren't important enough to be at risk. This biometric data that we're talking about should never be lost or mishandled or hacked or manipulated, but we know that that's not typically the way we hear about it. That's not typically the situation that our data is 100% secure once it's online. So I think that we're at the verge of a new start, worsened by COVID, of hyper-invasive human monitoring. I think it's all under the guise of increased speed and security and convenience. And so with that, I'd like to ask the question, who do these types of technology work for, and whose convenience do they really facilitate? And I'd also like to ask, whom do these technologies not work for? And what's the limit, if any, of data, specifically biometric data, that should and can be collected? Finally, the question is, who draws the line?
Thank you so much, Nakeema, for this important warning and for raising such critical questions. And I think these questions should be asked much more often. What I'm interested in, because you're coming at this from quite an interdisciplinary perspective, but you're also training women, right, to work in computer programming. How do you bring this critical perspective and how do you sort of merge this with this training of these women who actually have to enter this tech sector in which this data is collected?
What we end up doing is a lot of experiments. We end up doing a lot of personal testing to discover what's really going on in terms of the types of technologies that the women are often exposed to when they're applying for work. They're often exposed to when they're engaging with state and federal agencies around residence questions, around work permits. And it's really been an interesting ride the last 5 years that I've been leading the Frauenloop program with women trying to break into tech, to both educate those women as to how technology is always to be sort of tested and investigated in terms of what types of information is being used for what purposes, and also trying to perpetuate the idea that we are the ones that are making the technology sector what it is, and we are the ones who have the option to raise concerns about what types of tests, what types of outcomes are necessary in order for technologies to be considered good and to be promoted. It's a real balancing act in terms of the sometimes rather poor track record that a lot of the tech industry has for rolling out software that does not work well on women, or does not work well on ethnic and racial minorities, or is not particularly protective of the data privacy of its users. But these are things that you learn, as I've found, by doing. You learn through testing out, okay, what is the likelihood that this type of data or this type of information gets lost, gets hacked, gets into the hands of the wrong person or persons. And these are the kinds of things that women, particularly women from global international backgrounds, are especially good at investigating.
Thank you. And when you're raising these questions, also through the women that you or via the women that you train, do you encounter much resistance from the tech industry?
The resistance, I think, is mostly to the apportioning of blame. The difficulty with all of these technologies that are personalized around hypersecurity, especially in the wake of COVID, such as the biometric reading collection of Proctorio and other proctoring student software, various different softwares that supposedly aid in the debiasing of the hiring process. The resistance comes from being the type of voice that is questioning whether fair outcomes for everyone should be a requirement for biometric software that is used at scale. Very few people seem to be doing that. And being part of a minority that is very often mistaken, sort of mislabeled, and not very well served by different types of biometric software that we've seen, has made it maybe not the most uplifting comments when I comment on these things, but these are the kinds of voices that we're hearing around the world that are raising the alarm. There's a reason that Joy Bulimwini and Timnit Gebru and Deb Raji and other Black women from minority communities are the ones saying, hey, this is not necessarily a good outcome to roll out software that works for its creators and the groups that its creators immediately tested it on. there's a larger universe out there for whom there can be very, very poor or even dangerous outcomes that need to be investigated before these technologies become adopted on the public sector and private sector level, because real harm can be done.
Thank you. And you're addressing also racial bias, gender bias in these type of systems. Is it at all possible to unlearn these systems? Or should we start completely anew?
I don't know if unlearning is what we should be aiming for, but rather interrogating who is the target user and how this target user persona is developed when we have so many examples of specifically biometric software, but other kinds as well, that just exclude whole groups of humanity. I mean, this is a question of the process of testing and the process of inclusion. And if there's no inclusion for globally sold and globally implemented products, that should probably be something that certainly public sector agencies, but also private sector ones should consider.
Thank you so much. That gives us a lot of food for thought, I would say. I would now like to move on to the second speaker of today, which is who is Ella Jakubowska at the table here. Ella Jakubowska works at EDRI, the European Network for Collective for Digital Rights. And there she leads the advocacy on biometric technologies such as facial recognition. Ella contributes to the team's broader work on artificial intelligence with a keen interest in issues of power, justice, and how biometric technologies threaten our rights to equality and non-discrimination. Ella holds a Master of Science in Human Rights with a research focus on, which I very much like, feminist approaches to science and technology. And in 2021, Ella was named by Political Europe as one of the 28 top power players in the European tech space. Ella, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here today. So just before I jump into my intervention, I want to set up a little bit about my approach and how I got to these perspectives. So I work in policy and advocacy at EDRI, which is the largest collection of digital rights organizations in Europe. So that's organizations working at the intersection of human rights, laws, and technology. And we advocate to governments, whether that's national governments or EU institutions, to make sure that as laws are being developed on technologies and data, that people and society and human rights are put at the center. And through that work, I'm also one of the coordinators of the Reclaim Your Face campaign, which is a movement of around 65 organizations from across Europe, representing everything from environment to workers' rights to anti-discrimination. And we specifically look at facial recognition, and for a lot of use cases where we believe that they're just so harmful that they can't be made acceptable, they can't be made democratic, we're actually calling for them to be completely prohibited. So before I kind of start talking about some of the practices that go on in the use of facial recognition, I kind of wanted to pose a hypothetical question to everyone that's listening today. And that's to just think about, what is it that makes you, you? What are the different parts that constitute who you are and your identity? What's the link between your internal identity and your appearance? Are there sensitive things that are given away by your appearance? But on the other side of it, what are all the things about you that are really important, but that are missed out, that don't get included in your appearance? And I think that these are absolutely vital questions that should be asked when we're developing technologies that are centered around our faces, these things that are such a strong part of our identity. And the unfortunate thing is that we really see that governments around Europe, around the world, and companies that are developing these tools are just not asking these questions. We're already in the stage of rolling out technology before going through these big questions about what this means for our society and what it means for us as individual human beings. So just thinking about the use of facial recognition in Europe, That's not a hypothetical. We're seeing pretty much every country in Europe having facial recognition technologies to measure, identify, and track people in airports, train stations, sports venues, supermarkets, bars, doctors' surgeries, parks, all these spaces that we think of as essential parts of public life, we're actually being placed under constant surveillance. And typically, we'll see facial recognition algorithms looking at the distance between our eyes, the shapes of our cheeks, our eyes themselves to identify or analyze us. But increasingly, we're seeing companies experiment with all sorts of other ways. So Nakeema mentioned a few, but beyond that, we've seen tongue identification, breath, nose sweat, so little beads of sweat on your nose. All these things are being tried out. And if you just imagine that your breath could be enough to give away who you are and eradicate your anonymity in public places, well, nobody's able to not breathe, right? So thinking about what my problem is with these facial recognition systems, and I have many, so it's kind of hard to choose where to start. But I want to focus today on how they do this invisible process of deconstructing us and then reconstructing us, and why that's so problematic. So when we get captured by these devices, these cameras, what happens to our faces is that they're made into maths. So our skin, our features, our rich identity is just degraded into a set of data points. And we go from being a living, breathing human into being a set of numbers that can be put in a database. And this is done in a very binary way. We often hear about technology being ones and zeros, and that's the same thing. If you imagine how your identity would be simplified or flattened to try and fit it into a set of statistics, it really challenges a lot of these ideas about what it means to be human and what our faces and our identities actually represent. And it's incredibly invasive when you actually take a step back to think about what's happening there. A lot of groups, a lot of minoritized groups have a really long history of the state policing our bodies, whether that's women, whether that's migrants, whether that's racialized people. And we can think of this rise, this boom in facial recognition as kind of one more frontier for that kind of control. And so once our faces have been captured, they then get turned into what's called a template. And these templates are stored away in enormous databases that very often we've got no access to. Often we've got no knowledge that they even exist. And I think it's really interesting and quite chilling to think about what that actually means. If you imagine templates of millions upon millions of faces, what's happening to them? What might happen to them after we die, for example? These are questions that really aren't being worked through, and that when I look at our existing data protection laws that we have across Europe, we don't really have structures right now that are going to protect us in those ways. So we've kind of learned to run before we can walk. And then thinking about how these systems then reconstruct our faces after they've sucked out our essence and put it into a template, well, then they do something with it. They transform what our face is and what our face signifies. And they do this with a pretense of scientific validity. Because these systems are based on statistics, they're based on maths, there are often claims that they can reveal things about you that actually we absolutely know that they can't. So talking about categories, as Nakeema brought up, we're seeing facial recognition algorithms that claim to be able to know whether someone is gay or to know what their political orientation is. We've even seen in Norway, for example, a facial recognition system that was used for advertising that claimed to be able to tell whether someone was a man or a woman, and then target them with an advert either for pizza, if it believed they were a man, or salad, if it believed they were a woman. And so, this has really, really profound effects on every part of who we are, down to even the types of food that could be made available for us, all on the basis of how this system, how whoever is developing it, has decided to interpret our face. And I'm getting towards wrapping up, but I just want to raise the point about whose safety is it that we are talking about with these systems? Because we often hear that they're essential for safety, that this is a national security issue, and that's a really good way of shutting down the debate. But we've been working at EDRI with a lot of groups who represent Roma and Sinti rights, and they've pointed out, with these systems, Romani people's rights are definitely not what is being taken into account here. And likewise, Romani people's safety is not being considered through these systems. We're actually seeing often people being marked out as criminal because these systems so frequently are trained to identify or think they're identifying people loitering, people littering, people with parking violations. It really isn't about looking at the problems that stop society from being safe and thinking about how to constructively help people, for example, with welfare, with social security. Instead, it's about having these systems that are really quite punitive. So just to conclude, I kind of want to raise the point that facial recognition is not a technical problem, it's a political problem. It's about what we choose to invest in, shiny, exciting, sexy technology that claims to be able to tell all of these things, or social services, which are a lot less glamorous, but will probably be a lot more effective in tackling inequality and poverty. And really, at the end of the day, what they do is give even more power to those that have the resources to watch, whether that's governments or companies, and take even more power away from those of us that are watched. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. I really like what you're saying about that we need to ask this question, security for whom or safety for whom, right? I think a lot of these technologies have been installed because we're scared, perhaps, because we feel like this can really be a protection. But I think we really need to ask this question, who is the we in this? And does it really apply for everyone? Will it really make the world safer? And I think what your statement shows is that that's not so much the case necessarily. What I also noticed is that you talked about criminalization of these technologies and how they especially target marginalized groups in society. And this also very much reminds me actually of earlier cases of biometrics, which can already have its roots in the 19th century, when not yet facial recognition systems, but when skulls, for example, were measured for colonialist purposes. Do you know more about these colonial roots of biometric technologies, and is this something you could expand on?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole practice of trying to identify people as a means of control and identification comes out of two different colonial times. So you had when the British occupiers had colonized India, they brought in the world's first kind of wide-scale fingerprinting system, which was designed as a way for the colonized people to keep tabs on the oppressed people. And similarly, even before that, in the US a few hundred years ago, there was something called the Lantern Laws, where people who had been made slaves were forced to carry lanterns around at night to identify themselves. And so it's not biometrics in the way that we think about it now, but it's those very early roots that speak to this idea of some people need to be tracked, some people need to be hyper-visible in the public space. And it's always those people who've already been put in those positions of disempowerment that are then followed. And as if that's not bad enough, it gets even more sinister when you throw in the fact that some of these examples I've given, the one about the so-called gaydar that was detecting if people are gay from their faces, or the political orientation one that supposedly can tell your voting persuasion from your face. These kind of analyses actually have their roots in Nazi eugenic practices, and that's an area that we've worked on a lot with Roma and Sinti groups, because for Romani people in Europe, this is almost living memory. If you've lost family members, ancestors to a regime that measured your face, that looked at the shape and the size of your nose, and on that basis decided that you deserve to die, when we start seeing these technologies in our public spaces that we're all meant to be able to enjoy equally, it's kind of even more profound, because you've really got that painful historical experience and ongoing experience today, because we know that racialized people in Europe, so Romani people, people of color, migrants, Muslim people, are already vastly over-policed. And the police are one of the main institutions in our societies that deploy these technologies. So really, when we talk about making society safer, and you start listing the vast number of people that are harmed by these technologies, you could actually say, really, is it even a minority that's going to be made safer? Probably not.
Thanks so much for raising these very important points. And I think what you show through your talk is also how, we very much sort of went away as a society from thinking that biology is destiny, but now we seem to really go back to it, and we seem to want to classify again who we are on the basis of how we appear, how we look. And I think that's something that might be obscured by the fact that these technologies are often invisible, but also that they look so new and technological and fancy that we sometimes tend to forget that they actually have these very problematic historical roots. Thank you so much. I would now like to turn to the third speaker, who's sitting on this side of the table. This is Dr. Christine Quinnen, who is an assistant professor in gender studies at Utrecht University, but will soon leave Utrecht for Melbourne to take up a position in the School of Culture and Communication. Christine's research interests include queer theory, trans studies, post-colonial studies, and critical security studies. Christine's work on gender and surveillance has appeared in several journals and edited volumes. Christine is also the co-founder of the international research network called Gender Identity Registration and Human Rights Effects, which is based at Utrecht University. Christine.
Thanks, Rosa, and thanks a lot for having me on this panel. And what I'll talk about today has a lot of resonances already with what Nakeema and with Ella have already spoken about. Just to start, I'll say a little bit about the broader research project from which I'm speaking. In my research, I look to the convergence of security, technology, and law and hone in on border crossing as a key site of gender surveillance. I'm particularly interested here in security technologies that are built according to binary gender norms, body scanners, e-passports, and facial recognition software. And I look to the airport, which is perhaps the most securitized space in the current era, to analyze the intersection of biometric technology, identity verification, and expanding options for declaring legal gender. Border crossing is increasingly being politically framed as a national security threat, which Ella already mentioned, a framing that for some comes at the cost of rights, dignity, and ability to move. While the field of migration studies has offered new paradigms for understanding mobility, including how access to travel and migration is differentially distributed, it has underestimated how normative conceptions of identity are built into security technologies. Assumptions about race, gender, sexuality, and ability are encoded by scientists into the operational elements of the technologies, which are not constructed to deal with multiple identities, including those that diverge from white, cisgender, able-bodied norms. Growing empirical evidence points to the obstacles this poses for trans and non-binary individuals who may already be susceptible to interrogation and increased identity verification due to perceived mismatches between gender presentation and gender markers in documentation. When combined with the increased use of body-based biometrics, it becomes clear how this method of border management can have discriminatory and exclusionary effects, while also prompting critical questions regarding the role of binary gender as an often invisible structuring principle. Whereas in the pre-9/11 security era, the focus was on banned objects, this has shifted to the visualization of the human body through advanced technology. A consequence of this focus is that those who fall outside of markers of normative race, gender, sex, religion, ability become targets of biometric technologies, while those who are seen as quote-unquote normal citizens pass easily through visible and invisible checkpoints. Facial recognition, for example, has been taken to task as being inherently biased, as it is often unable to read darker skin tones because cameras are optimized for lighter skin. Cultural studies scholar Joseph Pugliese, for example, has shown how these technologies are calibrated to whiteness as the normative standard, writing, "Not to produce a template is equivalent to having no legal ontology, to being a non-being," end quote. In a sense, then, in the biometric world in which we live, one has to be biometrically readable in order to exist. So one such example of this is found in the use of millimeter wave full body scanners, which you can see on my slide, which were first adopted in Amsterdam at Schiphol Airport over a decade ago, but are now ubiquitous throughout the world. Particularly problematic about the technology is that the machines are built around binary gender. Security agents are forced to correctly assess each passenger's gender by pushing either a pink button or a blue button as we approach the machine. Bodies that do not match the security agent's reading as unequivocally male or female activate security responses. In being labeled suspicious or threatening, trans and non-binary individuals may then be detained, interrogated, or humiliated. Gender-diverse bodies, however, also challenge the fixity of biometrics, revealing the instability of relying on body-based data, which has ironically made them into tools to train biometric technologies. And I'll cite one example here. Under the guise of better refining facial recognition, computer scientist Carl Rosenek mined online videos of trans people documenting their transitions on YouTube. Although there are many large and freely available face databases, Rosenek argued that there was nothing documenting faces pre- and post-transition. He found this as a challenge for AI systems, as the current technology could not always identify trans people after transitioning, after hormone therapy. Biometric companies are currently honing facial recognition algorithms based on this analysis conducted by Rosenek, whose research has been funded by the US government, the US military, and the FBI, although the transgender dataset was purportedly never shared with any government agencies. While Rosenek justified the research as improving national security, and here it's worth noting that this has in fact been suggested that terrorists could undergo hormone therapy to outwit biometric face-based technologies, this sort of research poses obvious ethical concerns. Moreover, the notion of the face as quantitative code that says something about the individual has racial and colonial implications. In another recent study entitled How Computers See Gender, researchers Morgan Klaus Schurman, Jacob Paul, and Jed Brubacher analyzed thousands of face images from Instagram that were labeled with one of 7 hashtags: woman, man, trans man, agender, genderqueer, and non-binary. They then analyzed these images using 4 of the top facial analysis services. Overall, the services correctly identified cisgender women and cisgender men around 98% of the time. The accuracy rates drastically dropped for trans individuals, with trans men being incorrectly identified 38% of the time. When it came to individuals identifying as non-binary, agender, or genderqueer, they were misclassified 100% of the time. As the researchers of the study write, non-binary genders present a challenge for gender classification, but also highlight the challenges of designing human-centered systems built on computer vision infrastructure. In the eyes of these services, human beings can only exist on a male-masculine versus female-feminine spectrum, end quote. But while biometric technologies highlight how particular notions of gender are stabilized and disrupted through their inclusion into systems of organization and regulation, there might simultaneously be a possibility for destabilization, for technologies using binary gender signal the limits of the use of gender as biometric data and fixed code. Non-binary genders challenge these systems and, I hope, prompt critical reflections on the use of AI technologies. Just to conclude, the question of misclassification and misrecognition is particularly salient here. Non-binary individuals are always misrecognized in these systems, and these misrecognitions have real-life everyday impacts, including access to education, medical care, travel, migration, etc. And given its over-reliance in policing, facial analysis may be most acutely felt by trans people of color, who are already disproportionately targets of law enforcement. The use of facial recognition built around binary gender could also result in the outing of some trans people, which could further exacerbate discrimination. While biometrics and statistical surveillance supposedly provide proof that we are who we say we are, that burden of proof is unduly placed on those who do not match expected norms, facilitating exclusionary rather than inclusionary goals. Returning to Pugliese's point that not producing a template is equivalent to having no legal ontology, to being a non-being, we could similarly ask what effects are produced when facial recognition can, quite literally, only see 2 genders. We must, I think, be aware of the ways in which technologies are constructed around binary gender norms, and we must contest the effects that they may have when they fail to represent those who do not fit normative categories. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I'm really happy that you really go into depth with this and point at the issues when it comes to gender, especially in relation to biometrics and facial recognition. I see a paradox, interesting paradox appearing in what you're saying, because on the one hand, there's an issue that these technologies are built upon conceptions of gender that are binary, either feminine, female, masculine, male. So everything that sort of falls on between or somewhere else on the spectrum is invisible, not readable, a non-being to a facial recognition system or a biometric technology. On the other hand, of course, we're also facing the issue and the question, do we want gender to be securitized? And do you always want to be surveilled in public spaces? Because it's perhaps also a way out. So does that mean that recognition is perhaps not always what we should strive for?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And part of the work I do is also concerned with how recognition in a legal context in the form of documentation is very important and integral to one's sense of identity and respect and integrity. So I think here we really have to look at this paradox of what does recognition mean, and what are the spheres in which, say, being recognized by the state in one's gender is really important, yet at the same time we have systems that are being constantly used beyond what we even know, that people that don't identify within the binary are, like I was mentioning, always misrecognized. What is that? What are the effects of being kind of left out? So I think there's a tension here with visibility and invisibility that is really important. And I don't think we should be working to just be included in these, face data sets, because that's also problematic. Yet at the same time, if we think about how, like I was mentioning, access to services, education, technology, travel, all of these things are more and more reliant on systems like facial analysis and facial recognition, what are the effects going to be when one isn't, is misrecognized or isn't included at all? So I don't have necessarily an answer, but I think that we have to really look at this question of what recognition is in the legal sense, but also in the biometric sense, and really push back against visibility and of course the systems that track us and code us. And
I know that you have done a lot of interviews also. With people who are facing issues with this topic. Mm-hmm. Are there some strategies that they shared with you on how to navigate this tension?
Yeah, I mean, I look at airports as this site, and what I've noticed is a lot of people just avoid traveling at all, which I think is particularly problematic because it means actually choosing not to engage in certain behaviors, or not to be able to leave where one lives because of the problems that are associated with this. But also a lot of people I've spoken with have talked about how they will sort of alter their physical presentation, alter their gender presentation to not encounter issues because of the problems with body scanners, facial recognition, and mismatches between documentation and one's gender presentation. And I think this is something that we also really need to think more about, how this really is impacting people's everyday lives.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that really shows how it's not so much an issue of the digital anymore, mm-hmm. but how we're really facing, we cannot enter public spaces or even travel if we're facing these issues. So surveillance and facial recognition is really everywhere around us. All right, I would now like to introduce the fourth speaker, who's coming at this from a whole different angle. And that is Dr. Heather Dewey-Hagborg, who is a transdisciplinary artist and educator interested in arts as a research and critical practice. Her work includes the project Stranger Visions, which you might know, perhaps, in which she created portrait sculptures from analysis of DNA that she found in hair, in cigarette butts, and chewing gum that she collected from the street in public places. Heather Dewey-Hagborg has a PhD in electronic arts from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She is a visiting assistant professor of interactive media at NYU Abu Dhabi, a fellow at the Sundance Institute's Art of Practice program, and affiliated with research organization Data and Society. And on top of that, Heather is co-founder and co-curator of Refresh, a politically engaged collaborative platform that is situated at the intersection of art, science, and technology. Heather, please take the digital floor.
Hi, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here. And I've just want to express my gratitude for the conversation so far. It's been really fantastic, and I'm so happy to be able to contribute to that and join you all. So let me just try to share my screen, and we'll see if we can get some slides happening. Okay, great. So that's me, Heather Dewey-Hagborg. There's so many places that this could go right now. So I'm going to talk very briefly through a few projects leading up to one that is being displayed at IMPAKT, and let's see where that takes us. So I think one possible starting point here is stranger vision. So this is this work that I started in 2012 when I began collecting DNA from strangers. And basically this process began, it came from this kind of inspiration that I had in a therapy session, staring at this hair that was caught in a crack, this print across from me. And I just was staring at this hair and wondering, what could I learn about this person from this hair that they left behind? And it launched me on this whole journey into kind of exploring forensics and discovering the emerging tool of forensic DNA phenotyping, which is this attempt to create a picture of someone from nothing more than their DNA. And so at that point in time, in 2012, I started collecting these genetic artifacts, so hairs and chewed-up gum and cigarette butts and things like this, extracting DNA, analyzing it, and looking at locations in the genome where I could extrapolate something about what someone might look like based on emerging genomic science. And was using that as a way of kind of pointing attention to a new coming form of surveillance, which I think we still need to talk about. I mean, it just hits me so much having this conversation today about facial recognition, how continuous these issues still really are between the bio realm, this kind of physical realm of this messiness of the body, the liability of kind of shedding ourselves all the time in public, and the risks for genetic privacy. So that is still something I want to bring up that really needs addressing and that goes under discussed. And these tools, I mean, this one in particular, the forensic DNA phenotyping, builds on exactly the same technologies that have been in place for decades, actually, in terms of AI, looking at AI technologies, and how those have kind of mouthed into this facial recognition beast that we've been discussing here today. So in this first piece in 2012, I wanted to call attention to this kind of surveillance risk of shedding DNA in public spaces and showing that there was this new thing that was going to be coming, which was predicting someone's face from their DNA. And to make a long story short, because we don't have a lot of time, a few years later, a company in the United States started offering that service to police. And so at that point, I wanted to try to shift the conversation into creating more of a critical dialogue around this presentation of the face in this context, this generation of the face in this way. And so at this point in time, I started working with Chelsea Manning. It's another long story that I'd be happy to talk more about, a US whistleblower who was imprisoned for making public, among other things, information around the prevalence of torture and civilian deaths in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So Chelsea was imprisoned in a military prison. No one could visit her. No one could photograph her. She sent me her DNA, and I started to produce these DNA portraits of her while she was in prison. And when she was released, we had this collaborative exhibition that you see depicted here, probably Chelsea, where we presented 30 different interpretations of what Chelsea Manning might look like based on her DNA data. And so this just gives you kind of, I don't know, this quick kind of easy way of thinking there's so many different ways that your data can be interpreted. There's so many different stories that can be told about you based on exactly the same information, kind of how pliable that information is. Okay, so these are all Chelsea. So in making these works, I built on a background of art practice using programming, algorithms, machine learning, and a critical eye towards surveillance technologies that I'd been developing for about 10 years prior to that. And the piece that is being presented at IMPAKT, which is called How Do You See Me, kind of returns to those things, having traveled through this biological place as well. So this is a view of one of the videos that's presented in How Do You See Me? And so what we see here is the use of evolutionary algorithms to evolve images which are recognized by components of facial recognition systems either as a face, so either detected as a face, or recognized specifically as my face. But these are images that are generated computationally from scratch, from simple lines, from simple curves, things that don't look anything like what we humans normally would kind of conjure up if we think of what does a face look like. And so you can see what the evolutionary process looks like through these images. So these green rectangles show images that are identified as faces. And so what we do see here, and I didn't expect this to come out so quickly through this evolutionary process, but almost immediately presenting itself, that the archetypal face, the portrait that comes out of this process that constitutes, we could say, what faceness is according to these algorithms, is this white oval. So this reverse engineering process gives us a window into these inner operations of facial recognition technology and exposes some of the problematics that we've been discussing here today on this kind of visual level. The facial recognition part of the project generates images which are encoded similarly to my own face. So thinking about, this idea that through facial recognition technology, we're all maths. So this is like, look at the maths of my face and then start generating other pictures that have very similar numbers. And so these images are even stranger, really these totally alien pictures that show us just how different this form of so-called intelligence really is from our own and from the way that we think. And here's a couple images that came out as similar to my face. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share there and I'll say thanks.
Thank you so much, Heather. I think your art project, How Do You See Me, is quite shocking. It's quite shocking to me that our faces to machines are basically that sort of white oval that we see there. And it clearly also shows the bias of whiteness, the normativity of whiteness underlying to these systems. So I think it's really important that your work exposes that. But I can imagine that for some members in the audiences, this was also quite complex. So I would like to ask a brief question of clarification, because you mentioned that your face has a number and you put that into the technology. Could you expand a bit more on that? How has your face a number, and
yes,
how did that work further in your project?
Absolutely, yes. There's a very much speeding through everything, so I apologize for that. So what I'm trying to show here is that there's more than two steps. There's really three steps in a facial recognition system. So there's the first step, that's the detection. And this is what we see so often when we use the camera on our phones, and you see this little box that appears around all of the people's faces, or maybe not all of the people's faces when it fails. And so that's the detection step. And then there's another step that comes in between that might analyze different aspects of the face. So for example, this landmark, so where are the eyes, where's the nose, where's the mouth? That middle part I didn't look at in this particular project. And then the third part is the part of matching a face to a face in the database. And so this is often this kind of problem of the archive. So you have lots of pictures of people who you want to recognize, and then you take the picture from the camera, from the surveillance camera, you need to match it against someone in a database. And so this is the kind of, these particularly strange pictures that I show at the end are where I look at, so looking at just the recognition part of that pipeline, there is this vector that represents my face to a facial recognition algorithm. In this particular case, I was using a neural network algorithm for this purpose. And so I put my face in, I saw what is the vector that represents my face that comes out. And then I used code to start generating other images and trying to get closer and closer and closer to that vector, so that when I put those images into the system, it of course spits out a number for them as well. And so I wanted to see how close can I get generating this seemingly arbitrary picture, this very strange picture that looks nothing to me like a face, how close can I get to my own face through, this kind of ground-up generative system? So it shows us that there is this strangeness there. Now there's a multitude of other pictures that I could generate that would also be close to my face in some ways. And so this just gives us one window into part of how we're seen.
Thank you. Your work is on show now at IMPAKT, and what I noticed is that a lot of people first just look at the work and they don't really know exactly yet what they're looking at. And I found that especially photographers are quite interested in it, also because it has quite special visual components. As an artist, how do you look at these digital portraits? Do you think much gets lost in transformation, or is maybe something gained as well?
Well, I hope that the portraits make us think a bit about representation and really think about, well, what does it mean to represent someone? What does it mean to try to embody that in a model and kind of bring us into thinking about this process of modeling and representation? And so I always hope with my work that there is a strong visual that draws people in. They don't necessarily know what it is right away. Same thing with a 3D printed face, right? You don't necessarily know what that means or what it is, but you're drawn in to have a closer look. And then I hope that upon that closer look and closer reflection, there can come a process of understanding, or at least of intrigue, that might draw you in through curiosity to wanting to learn more.
Thank you. All right, I would now like to move to a broader discussion. I think what we've learned so far is indeed that technology, or that facial recognition technology, are not just technological, but they're very much social. They very much have to do with issues of identity, of power. Technologies are never neutral. They don't exist in a vacuum. And it serves different audiences differently. And therefore, it's really important to constantly keep asking these questions. For whom is this technology designed? By whom, for what purposes, in which context is it used, and in which context is it not used. As I said, I would now like to move to a discussion. I see already some questions popping up. That is very good. If you still want to ask a question, but you forgot where to do that, I'll mention it once again. You can go to sli.do/do, and the password is NFF in capitals 2021. So if you still have some questions, make sure to ask them in the chat. We have identified quite a range of issues so far. And I think I can imagine that maybe some members of the audience will feel also a bit paralyzed and very scared, which is important because that is also where critique starts and critical perspective starts. But of course, I think we also should think about possible solutions, or at least ways to move forward from here. And I would like to start thinking about that, asking a question to you, Ella, because you briefly already mentioned the Reclaim Your Face campaign. And I think that's actually something that's quite practical, right, to do, even today.
Absolutely, yeah. We also felt this sense of there's this rising dread about how these technologies are being used and abused, or in some ways, even when they're used as they're meant to be used, it's an abuse. So we wanted to do something about it. So we launched this campaign, Reclaim Your Face, and it's a load of different acts of resistance joined together under an umbrella. So one of the main things that we're doing is, as I kind of alluded to earlier, our view is that there are some uses of facial recognition that just don't have a place in our society, that no amount of improving them is going to help, that just at their core, they're about incredibly intrusive surveillance, and that can never be justified. So,
and can you briefly give an example of that? When do you think it's really...
There are many, but at a protest is one example. I mean, really, we think if you're going about in a public space, any sort of device that's scanning everyone that walks through that space and analysing them, identifying them, shouldn't be allowed, because you don't have control over it. You can't properly give consent because if you have to go through it to go to a protest, a park or a supermarket, you're not really making a proper choice to give your face data. So as part of that campaign where we're resisting these kind of uses, we've got something called a European Citizens Initiative. And this is a legal process that gets recognised by the EU, by EU institutions. if we reach 1 million signatures. So through that, we're gathering signatures. We're at about 61,000 so far, which is amazing when you think about 61,000 people, what that means. But at the same time, we've still got a long way to go. So one kind of tangible thing that we ask people to do is just sign this initiative. And for those that are here in person, I've got some paper forms that people can sign. But if you saw my slide earlier, you can also do it online. And that's a really strong way to say to our leaders, whether that's on a national level or EU level, that we don't see a place for effectively biometric mass surveillance in our societies. But that's also not the only form of resistance that we do through our campaign. We do a lot of calling on authorities to be more transparent and to tell us what they're doing, because so much of it is shrouded in secrecy. And we work with artists to kind of perform individual acts of resistance. So we developed a face mask, a COVID mask, because actually during COVID, these systems got a lot worse. People thought, this is great, I'll be wearing a mask, no one can identify me. But they just kept improving the technology to be able to identify you from just your eyes. So we built a mask that's meant to scramble the tech. It works a bit. It doesn't work completely, which is why you need to sign our petition, because this is our answer. Only a law will do. And sometimes we also put paper bags on our head as a symbol of resistance. So we've been to the European Parliament and other places to just show that we shouldn't have to put a bag on our heads to have respect for our dignity and our autonomy. So it's a really wide-ranging campaign, and if people want to get involved, they can sign it, but they can also write to their council, to their politicians. In the Dutch context, we've got a horrifying report that actually shows some of the most scary, chilling experiments with these technologies are actually happening in the Netherlands. So yeah, you can check that out at reclaimyourface.eu.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think that really leaves us with a very practical thing to do as well. I find it also interesting that you mention putting a paper bag up over your face. I know that in Hong Kong, especially, there's a lot of issues when it comes to facial recognition in demonstrations, in public demonstrations. And I know that a lot of people, for example, used umbrellas to hide from it, but that has now also been forbidden to do so. So I think it's a constant sort of struggle to find ways to resist. But this is a very, very tangible one. Nakeema Stefflbauer, you are situated at sort of a different position, also working more closely with the tech sector. Where do you see any ways to move forward or constructive possible solutions, perhaps even?
I think partially Ella's solution is one of the best, because it's a tangible campaign that highlights the importance of regulation, and it gives the power back to the public and informs the public that this is something happening now that you need to be aware of and get involved in at the present. In terms of other ways forward, there are many different technologies that have sprung up, typically in the open source community, around personally, individually masking or cloaking your images, your face, your video footage. Data poisoning is increasingly popular as a way to avoid providing information that automated systems can use in any meaningful way. But as I've heard from many people who are both flabbergasted at the scale of these operations, these surveillance operations within the private and the public sector, in private and public spaces, and I've heard from technologists who feel that, they should know better. They should have known that this was already at this dangerous level. We shouldn't have to be worrying about and protecting all of our biometric information, from our face to our voice to the way we walk to the way we're interpreted potentially by some software that's in use by other organizations, public organizations. We really are not at a stage yet where individuals can be given the responsibility of protecting themselves from these invasive technologies. This is, in my view, a regulatory issue that has to be a link to human rights, human dignity, and has to be linked to the realities of what's happening right now. Many of the examples that were given during this panel explain that these are slippery slopes that we're on in terms of facial recognition and surveillance in the public sector, in the public sphere, very quickly and already in real time having moved into the private sphere, and the information that is being gleaned and is being sold with or without the public's knowledge about who we are, how we're classified, and where that information goes. And never does this end up being the places that we choose or that we want our information to be shared. So it's really time for us to start ringing the alarm and letting people know it's not a Black Mirror episode. This is real life, and this is really going to happen unless we make legal change as soon as possible.
Thank you. So the law is definitely a place to look at for this. I find it also so interesting and important that you point out how invisibility is also a big issue. How there's a lot of people not very much aware of the risks and issues at stake. Heather, do you think artists can play a role in making or perhaps exposing these dangers and risks?
Yes, absolutely. I think in terms of exposing them, that's happened a lot already. So I think that is very well established, kind of the showing part of showing the damages, showing the problematics, showing the risks. There's a lot of art happening in that space. But I think that there are at least two more ways that art can kind of help in this very tangible way that we're discussing. And so one is in its role as being a public policy medium. So art can perform the kind of speculation of public policy. It can invite us into thinking through different possible futures, different future scenarios, trying them on, seeing what fits. What do we want? What don't we want? So we can use art as this speculation medium for testing out different possible futures and thinking about different forms of legislation, for example, thinking of different forms of technologies, what is okay, what isn't okay. But then there's this deeper level, and I think this is really an important one. So we've been talking a lot today about how this technology is really so fundamentally flawed that there's really problems at such a base structural level that we might want to reject it altogether. And this is really the question. Is it just about public spaces, or is it also about the things like unlocking your phone? Is it about the more seemingly innocuous uses that don't have to do with the state as well? Is it that the technology is actually so problematic that we don't want it anywhere? And so I think art can come in here because art is also a medium for hacking. And so we can take these tools, we can take them apart, we can break them down into their pieces, we can see how they work. And we can determine if on that minute level, there's anything worth saving or not. Or do we throw it all out? Maybe we throw it all out. But if there are pieces worth saving, then we can pull them out and we can hack them together. We can reassemble them. We can build new pieces. We can hopefully pull together a much broader and more diverse group of people to work on a task like that, of really parsing out what are the little bits that might still be worth something, and what would they look like if we put them together in a radically new way.
Thank you. I very much have to say that I really like this hacking approach, and it could create a lot of new perspectives. And I also think art can very much embody or create metaphors that sometimes are so important when these issues are so abstract and so complex. It can really make things more tangible. So I also really think that this should be an interdisciplinary conversation, and that there's sort of parallel routes that we really have to think together. And on that note, Christine, do you see ways to move forward or possible solutions?
Yeah, I'm really glad about what you shared, Heather, because I feel like this is really an important point that, even all of us who are very critical of these technologies, some of us also do rely on them at the same time, even anyone that uses Facebook or even just taking a photo and immediately the technology is there to recognize, to match. And people, I think, have sort of found this to be helpful in some ways. So I think we do need to recognize that despite resistance, that this is not necessarily going anywhere anytime soon. And that here, I think we need to also think about how we can represent all types of people in AI, because we see the effects that this can have when certain populations are overrepresented and other populations are underrepresented. And I think in terms of gender, I think we really need to ask, how is gender being classified, and then what is being done with that. Of course, advertising is one thing, but we can think about that slippery slope that Nakeema mentioned. And I don't think it's out of the question to imagine something like public restrooms having, facial recognition as a requirement for entry. If I think about the U.S. and many states that have introduced these bathroom bills that really prohibit people from using a bathroom that differs from the sex that is in their birth certificate, from actually accessing what we think of as a right. So I think we really need to think about, beyond our imaginations, what can be done with this when it comes to kind of foreclosing access to services and rights. And at the same time, think about how do we represent all types of bodies? How do we teach ambiguity to AI? And what is our role as humans in terms of gender? It's not computers who should define gender, but people define gender. So I think these are all important things to be thinking and asking critical questions about.
Thank you. I think these are very, very important points. What I'm also wondering about is questions of accountability, or also what can you do when you are misrecognized, and how can we know in which databases we exist, sort of, as I know Heather once used this term, the data ghost, which I very much liked. Is there anyone who has some ideas about that, how we can speak up?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit. I mean, part of the reason why we're calling for legislative solutions is because we don't want the burden to be on individuals, because it is so hard. These are real structural issues, political issues that demand a structural and political solution. At the same time, laws like the General Data Protection Regulation do give individuals some rights over this. So there's something called a data subject access request, where any person, if they think that a company is holding data on them, or a government, you can request it and you can get a copy of that data. And we've started doing that with some companies to try and see if we can start even understanding a bit about these templates and how they have been conceptualizing us. Because I mentioned the COVID masks that we created to try and scramble the tech struggled, because often we just can't keep up with how fast the technology is moving. Every company has a different type of system, a different technology. So that's kind of one minor way that we can start to redress the power imbalance a little bit. But beyond that, that's exactly why we are looking at more structural ways of fighting back.
Thank you. Are there any other thoughts on this? Not so much, I think. Well, when you get to one, please let me know. Heather, you in your project mentioned not only facial recognition surveillance, but also DNA surveillance. Is this the future? Is this maybe the next step we should be worried about?
I think, so someone, I forget who it was, who brought up earlier about how with COVID things have kind of slipped into an even more invasive situation. And I do fear that with the kind of pervasive DNA testing that's happening, there is a major risk there. So I do fear that actually the DNA kind of surveillance risk is very, very close now, much closer than I would have thought a few years ago, because we are kind of giving our fluids and our DNA, our data, our cells away all the time in order to get access to things that we need. Like you might need to do that in order to get access to your place of work or to the grocery store, for example. And the problem is that the labs that are analyzing these samples are often the very same labs that are analyzing samples from the recreational genomics companies, for example, like 23andMe. So in the United States, there's one big company that does almost all of these analyses. And so they have all the data, they have all the cells, they have all the fluids, and it's pretty much up to them what they want to do with it. as there isn't really any regulation around that. Of course, in Europe, things are a little bit different. There's different regulations in different countries, and then there's GDPR and so on. But there remains a lot to be done on that front. And so I do think that it is actually a very pressing risk as well to really revisit these questions of bioprivacy, genetic privacy, and make sure that the samples that we're giving for these very good purposes, for very worthwhile purposes, don't get abused. So that's one particularly pressing risk, I think, around biological surveillance that is really directly here at this moment.
Thank you. To me, it also feels like these technologies and these developments go much faster than we go with developments in law, or maybe it seems like we're quite far behind, actually. Is that the case, Ella, or perhaps even Christine?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the legal framework that we have in the EU is not designed to move as fast as technologies that are changing every single day. And at the moment, the European Commission, which is the kind of legislative arm, one of the legislative arms of the EU, has proposed a new law called the Artificial Intelligence Act. And with this proposal, it could really change how we govern these types of technologies all across the world, because we know that with the GDPR, which was our data protection law, the EU kind of set a lot of standards that other countries have either adopted or deliberately decided not to adopt. So it really created a new standard. And so with this AI Act, we've got a chance to say how we want not just biometric technologies to be used, but also some other potentially really harmful technologies, things like algorithmic management, where workers are subject to kind of constant and highly invasive performance assessments by a machine, predictive policing, social scoring, allocation of welfare. It goes a lot broader as well than just biometrics. There's kind of a whole spectrum of different technologies that we're in a unique moment to legislate on them. And if it's a strong law, we could see things being done really well. And if it's a weak law, which is also a risk, then we could see people's rights increasingly being experimented with.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I would now like to turn to the questions, because I see we have gotten many. I see a question about facial recognition, and it says, talking about facial recognition technologies and it's failing to recognize certain people's faces, is it the fault of the technology, or is it rather the implementation of it? Nakeema, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. In terms of the technology has been described is, for the most part, math. You're trying to boil down the human characteristics and the markers of someone's visual identity into numbers. You are trying to match those against a database of other individuals' biological markers that have been reduced to math. And the people who are most often misidentified or not categorized as human at all, as we've also seen in social media examples where Black people have been labeled as gorillas and primates and all kinds of things. These things happen as a result of an insufficiently diverse group of technologists implementing this technology, looking for examples of poor confidence levels when matching faces of people of different skin tones, people of different genders to the database of faces that they're trying to correlate. And this comes from a complete disregard for the need of a certain standard of performance before rolling these technologies out. And I think that's where, is it a fault of the implementation? This depends on who you believe needs to be served by technologies that are publicly available or that are implemented at scale globally. If everyone needs to be included and the software should work equally well for everyone, then no, these technologies should not be implemented. But if it's okay and you're fine with having certain populations having a far, far less accurate usage and accurate readings based on the databases and the optimizations that have been done, then you have the situation that led to the suspension of, I think, Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft's facial recognition software being sold to law enforcement in North America, because they couldn't guarantee that it wasn't being misused and it wasn't performing really poorly on women and people of color, and one presumes other groups, after it was shown to be the case by the research of the coded bias, I believe, study, gender shades study that was done on facial recognition technologies.
Thank you. A question relating to that is, how does algorithmic racism affect the future of development of these technologies in third world countries? If the database used to train this mainly consists of cis Eurocentric men. Any thoughts on that?
The question was, how does it affect
the development and I think also the implementation in third world countries?
Well, it's the same as any. It affects the development and the technological advancement of those countries in the same way as it does the inclusion and development of all of the marginalized populations that are not well served by the technologies that are being rolled out. If you have, I'll take, for example, any online software that is optimized for a specific group, and your group, your region, your ethnicity is not included as part of the target model, then these are technologies that are going to work less well, if at all, for your group, for your region. And the fact that these technologies are being adopted by your governments, by your companies, as if they worked well and were tested on your group is really the problem. This actually reminds me of this the iPhone X release, where they had a couple of lawsuits because the facial unlock software was not working so well for Asian faces. And they were sued by a couple of different customers who discovered that, their colleagues at work and their friends and their siblings and all kinds of people could open their phones because the facial recognition software as rolled out on this new device was not functioning for Asian women.
Thank you so much, Nakeema. I see that there's a question concerning law, and the question is there a EU law that prohibits face recognition AI in the online, in the digital sphere? I'm looking at you, but I think also I should be looking at Nakeema.
Well, already I've mentioned a couple of times the General Data Protection Regulation, and that says that the processing of people's biometric data is prohibited, whether that's in the online space. So Clearview AI, we've all heard of Clearview AI, who are a company that became infamous for scraping social media profiles of literally millions, if not billions of people to create these big facial recognition databases, which they then sold as a service to law enforcement. Actually, in the EU, that's already been found to be illegal. We had what's called the Data Protection Authority in Germany saying, yeah, if they've got any EU citizens in their database, then what they're doing is technically illegal in the EU. But that hasn't stopped them. We've not actually seen any action. They said that it was illegal. They also said that every single person that's been impacted would need to complain to be able to access their right to have their data removed, to redress the fact that this is illegal. And that's just absolutely bizarre. And that doesn't keep us safe, because these things have happened without our knowledge, without our consent. So most of us don't even know whether or not we're in these databases. We don't, I have a friend who, his friend made a data subject access request. And when she sent him the picture that Clearview had sent her, he was in the background, his face just standing next to a sofa. And so even though he didn't have a social media profile, he'd been included through a photo that somebody else had taken of her. So it's this really complex web, and I think that really shows why you cannot put the burden on the individual. And I think some companies are starting to realize this, and compared to some other regions, we do have better protections in the EU. The reason that we're campaigning is because it's still not good enough. It needs to be stronger. We're seeing massive abuses. But PimEyes, for example, are maybe a less known company. They're a bit like Clearview AI, but they've offered individual facial recognition. So their app, anyone that can pay 20 euros a month can get their app, and you could put it onto somebody who's sitting in a coffee shop behind you, and it would tell you who that person is, information about them, link it to their social media profile. And once once attention started being put onto them in the EU, they relocated to the Seychelles so that they would be outside of the remit of EU data protection laws. So we're seeing some companies really doing a lot to try and avoid that regulatory scrutiny, and lobbying really, really hard to get laws that aren't going to restrict them. And when you have those of us in what's called civil society, so working for non-governmental organizations, and we see big companies that have budgets of 10 to 20, 30 times bigger than what we have to go and speak to politicians. That's why it's so important that we kind of harness people to speak out and need to raise awareness about these issues and not just keep them in the corridors of old, stuffy Brussels buildings.
Thank you so much. And I also recognize something that you say there about this person who was on the background of another person's photo. And I think personally, I started using social media at some point also as a way to look back, to get some sort of access to how I appeared online. And this is really like, you're sort of stuck within this. Yeah. Sometimes it can really feel that way. So I like that you're saying that we don't only need this individual approach, but it's very much about politics and structure as well. One of the questions that I saw appearing was about the psychological need to use AI and face recognition systems to classify the population. And I think this very much attends to the question of why do we want or even have this urge to classify persons? Christine, could you say something about that?
I think it's an excellent question. I don't know if I have an answer to it, but I think the conversation we're having now points to the fact that how just every day these practices of classification, categorization are invisible and visible, of course. And I think that in terms of the psychological aspects of it, I can't really speak to that, other than that I think we do, again, need to start kind of paying attention to the fact that, again, I'm coming from a gender studies angle, how gender is constantly being, we're asked about our gender, for services that have nothing to do with our gender. And I think that that's also a place that we need to push back on, whether it's companies or government agencies that are asking us to identify our gender. And this is part of the work I do in the project here, Gender Identity Registration and Human Rights Effects, of, okay, how does this actually impact people when we're constantly being asked to share that piece of information? And I think that that's also a question of privacy. And typically, when we're asked to identify our gender, we're given two options. And again, it speaks to this constant sort of need, it seems, to sort people and categorize people, and that in ways we don't always, of course need, but is there. So I think it's just really asking, okay, why is this necessary? And there is work being done here in the Netherlands on that, of starting to take a critical look at when that question is asked, is it actually necessary?
Thank you. Ella, in a preparatory meeting, You mentioned that the fight against facial recognition finds a quite unlikely ally in the church. And I was very surprised by this. I don't know if any of the other members here, speakers here, were aware of that. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, and it's part of why this movement needs to have broad allies, and actually we can find consensus and points that we share with all sorts of groups. And so this particular religious example was the Pope spoke out and actually had a meeting with Microsoft about artificial intelligence, what these technologies mean. And we've spoken with some European groups representing different religious communities, and there's lots of different ways that facial recognition and these technologies can be harmful. But one of the questions that I think is really interesting that really hasn't been explored is, when we're going back to kind of the point of this particular panel, thinking about identity and politics and bodies and the self, what does it mean for our soul and our essence, whether you are a religious person or not? There's something about each of us that makes us human, and philosophers for thousands of years have been trying to figure out and pin down what makes us human. Where does our brain and our body begin and end, and how do all of these things fit together? And if we can't even figure out these questions, then how on earth are we expecting a machine to be able to figure that out for us? But we've absolutely seen some groups saying just the very intrinsic idea of putting a human into a piece of technology is really, really problematic. And it could mean a lot of things for our autonomy, our free will, our dignity. And so, again, I think it's great that we're approaching this question from lots of different angles, because then the other angle would be that in Germany, for example, we've seen places of worship being placed under specific surveillance by these technologies. Cologne is one city where not just places of worship, but doctors' surgeries, LGBTQ bars, all these places that when you go to them could be associated to a particular religion, gender identity, sexuality, health status, that you're being targeted, singled out, tracked, remembered. There's so many different ways that as a person with faith or a person without, you can be harmed.
Thank you. I think what we have done thus far in the panel is to become aware of unwanted facial recognition. And somebody in the audience is asking, well, if we become more aware of this, could we lose the spontaneity of public life and find ourselves in a rigid place as a society? Heather, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that it is, we can look at places around the world. So, I'm not sitting in Europe right now, actually. I'm sitting in the United Arab Emirates. And it's a very different situation here than it is in the Netherlands. And I think if you look to places like where I'm sitting, you get an idea of what the effect of pervasive surveillance is on people and on their behavior. So, when you live in an environment of total surveillance where you're being watched on so many different levels, by so many different entities, by your neighbors, by the government, by corporations, of course you modify your behavior so that you can't be judged, and certainly so that you can't be prosecuted for things that might be illegal in the place that you live. And so there's just a huge amount of risk there. The more information that is there, the more that you're being recorded, the more that's being logged, the more it can be misconstrued, used against you. And of course, we modify our behaviors accordingly. We don't want to be seen doing something that could be construed as being illegal, certainly. And certainly we don't want to be seen also as doing things that we think, for example, our friends wouldn't approve of, or colleagues, or just random people on the internet, maybe. So I do think that the answer is yes, we will definitely, and we already are, very much modifying our behavior according to what it is to live in this kind of surveillance bubble where we're being seen all the time, but we're also being judged.
Thank you. So becoming aware might make us feel less safe, but maybe that's also a good thing and could be a reason to, well, at least sign a petition, ask critical questions, keep the conversation going. Yeah, I think that really gives us a lot of things to think further with. All right, we are coming at the end of this panel. So that means that I would really like to thank all the speakers. I would really like to thank Ella, Christine, Nakeema, and Heather for being here and sharing your wonderful insights and perspectives. I really think you shared a lot of different dimensions and perspectives on the issue. And if you're interested in this theme and think I want to know more about it and also have a visual to it and see the work of Heather Dewey-Hagborg, know that there's an exhibition right now at IMPAKT, also called Face Value, that explores very much the same questions as we have been doing here today. It's on show until October 10. So if you're interested, make sure to get there in time. And for now, I would also like to thank the Netherlands Film Festival and specifically Pauline Dresser, who's the curator of this larger digital culture program. I would like to thank the crew and everybody who made this possible. And of course also IMPAKT and you, the audiences, for listening and for asking such wonderful questions. I'm curious to see how you now go out on the street and if you will behave differently. I'd be happy to hear that. Yeah, thank you and enjoy your afternoon.